early, but next weekend is Easter weekend, so we had to do it today.
What day is the final?
Oh, it's still, for you, it's April 23rd, Tuesday, April 23rd. And that's the final week. And for, how many people are in Liz's class? Okay, so I'm not sure, it's probably, my guess is that Wednesday, April 24th, that's a guess, I'm not sure. Either Wednesday or Thursday, and how many people are in Mary's class? My guess is Wednesday, April 24th. That would be the last, that's the last, it's always on the last day of your myology. Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, so whatever, like if your last day of the week in myology is Tuesday, it's on Tuesday. If your last day is Wednesday, it's on Wednesday. I don't think anyone has myology on Thursday. It's always, I don't think so. I don't know, that's not my business. It's that week. It's that week, and the teacher will tell you. I mean, I know what my final is, but it's probably for everybody else. My guess is it's on Wednesday. That's a guess, I'm not sure. Which is the April 24th, so, okay. And now, this is a very general review, and I will cover everything. Now, the only problematic subject, at least, is axial muscles, muscles of the axial skeleton. So, I know I didn't cover that yet. So, you didn't cover it either. Okay, so we're gonna take it off the final one. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so you're in Liz's class?
We
Okay.
just started, right?
Okay, so I'll cover that, but you're up to, it's gonna do that the next class you have, that's my guess. You're gonna do it this coming week, so you'll be totally prepared. So I won't spend too much time on that. I'll play that by ear actually, because if you haven't had it, it's hard for me to review it. But I can give an intro of what to expect on it. You know, I can give an overview of how to prepare for that without having to go into every single muscle. Okay, so it's like the final is similar to the A&P1 final in structure. There's 50 multiple choice questions, okay? And about 2/3 are actions, 1/3 attachments. That's the usual mix. On your quizzes, it's probably the same. 2/3 actions, 1/3 attachments. Okay, now I'm just gonna move this a second first. But there usually is a diagram question. They usually, in the past, there's a diagram question. And I'll give you the standard one. It could vary, but there's a standard type of diagram question. And people get scared when I start to show it because they don't realize, they think you have to fill in the name of the muscle. That's why I wrote this on the board. What they tend to show, now it can vary, but okay. Can you see this chart? You can come closer if you need to. Usually they'll show an anterior view and a posterior view. And many muscles will be labeled. Many muscles will be labeled like there'll be no names, but there'll be like an A, a B, a C, D, E, F, G, H, and then this one the same way. Everything will be labeled. There'll be a lot of muscles, not every single muscle, but a lot of, usually the large superficial muscles will be labeled with a letter. And then they'll say for each, like number one, let's say on the, might be trapezius. So this is too easy, but it's like if there are 10 of these, which there sometimes is, that's 20 points. Everyone should get those 20 points because there's nothing complex here. So let's say it's trapezius. Is everyone? Okay, so then not gonna ask up or lower, but you would just, whatever letter's there, and usually they'll have the posterior ones first or the anterior ones. They're not gonna be, even if they're mixed, it's not gonna matter. It's not gonna matter. So if they had latissimus dorsi, everyone, you would just, I'm sure everyone knows where that muscle is. So you would just, whatever letter, if that was a B, you would just put B next to latissimus dorsi. And then rhomboids, if they had a deeper side like this, that would be rhomboids, whatever letter that is. And the next one is biceps femoris. Now, there you'd have to know it's the lateral hamstring. They could have semitendinosus, the medial one, but that would be biceps femoris, gastrocnemius. They're not going to ask to distinguish medial lateral. And soleus, there would be that. If they show soleus, it would have to be a deep view. So clearly, this one is soleus. Does that seem straightforward? Mm-hmm. No one should get any of this wrong. Because sometimes when I say this, people say, oh, I have to fill in the name. You don't have to fill in anything. You just have to put the letter that's pointing to the muscle asked. That's, everyone clear on that? So you don't have to, it's not a fill-in question where you have to write the name. You just have to pick the letter pointing to that muscle. Okay. Mm-hmm. Which meaning is pretty much the same as multiple choice. So if I go to the anterior one, we haven't done sternocleidomastoid, but that's the large muscle of the anterolateral neck. That's this muscle. Don't worry about that. That's going to be covered. Usually that's the very first muscle in axial. And then pec major, straightforward. But if they'd have to have a deep view, that's pec minor. That would be pectoralis minor. External oblique is this one. Oh yeah, we haven't done that yet. That's going to be done next couple of classes. So that's external oblique. If they had rectus abdominis, that's the one in the the midline. Then sartorius, everyone knows that one. That would be sartorius. And rectus femoris, dead center. If they had vastus medialis or vastus lateralis, they wouldn't have intermedius here, but rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis. And it's hard to show lower leg, but the only one that really stands out that you can easily tell in an anterior view is this one, tibialis anterior. Okay, so there'll probably be a diagram of that type. Once in a while I've just seen the same thing and they just show anterior lower extremity and have muscles, and I've seen where they just have anterior upper extremity and show muscles. So what's the name of this muscle? Anybody? Biceps, I think brachii. And then, say it again? Someone said femoris, but I don't know.
No, it's wrong.
Okay, but that won't be an issue, but biceps femoris, biceps brachii, and what would this name of this muscle? Now, which is part of,
Deltoid.
and which part of deltoid?
Anterior one.
Yeah, anterior deltoid. And what's this muscle?
Oh.
It's the most lateral, brachioradialis. Brachialis is hard to show because it's deep to biceps. This is brachioradialis. Now the rest of them are so bundled together, but what's the one dead center? The one totally dead center?
Palmaris longus.
Good, palmaris longus. And the one that's the most medial on the anterior form?
Oh.
This is probably, we just did this probably, so.
Is the ulnaris.
Flexor carpi ulnaris. That's flexor carpi ulnaris. Good. Okay. It's hard to distinguish. Those hard to show, except for brachioradialis, which stands out, because they're all bunched together. And okay, and okay, so that's the first issue, diagram type questions, but they will be ID. There'll be an ID type of question, just like this. This is the format. They give you the name of the muscle, and you just have to put the letter that corresponds to the name. Okay. issue, do you have any specific questions, anything? Okay, so I'll just go and, okay, so the next issue is how to prepare for this test. Study, no, I'm just kidding. But what to study? It's like this too much, actually, maybe. So the best way, generally, and the same applies to the AMP1 test, so you probably know already, I would say just read through the iTunes U, just through the notes, the iPad notes, or your own notes, or both, a few times. Read, like, the notes, like, for everything, but don't try to memorize. Just, like, read them for familiarity. Don't try to memorize, because there's too many details to memorize, and you can drive yourself crazy. Eventually, I'll pinpoint what you really do need to memorize, but I would say, as you're studying, just read through all the notes quite a few times. And then the best way, after that, you have, maybe you didn't get them all, by the time you're taking the final, you'll have approximately 14 tests, like 7 quizzes, 7 homeworks. Even if it's a little less than that, it won't matter. You'll have like 13 or 14 tests, and the questions on the final aren't going to be that much different. Just then take all the tests and see what you know and what you don't know. Take all those tests, and hopefully you'll find out what you know and what you don't know. And then go back and study, especially what you're weak on, if anything, study that, and at some point, just read over the notes again, and take all the tests again. There's enough time to do that, maybe, you have quizzes, I know we have 2 quizzes this week, my class, do you have, but we missed today, you probably just have 1.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's one good way to study. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go through actions first. Now, I've done this in chart form in my class, but I think I'll just do it verbally, because if I try to do it in chart form, it might take hours and hours and hours. But when we get to axial, since no one has charts on that yet, I'll probably make up charts for axial muscles, just as an overview, to give you an idea of what to expect and how to organize it. Because there's not more, because axial comes last, and we didn't spend much time on it, it doesn't mean that there's going to be more questions on axial relative to others. It's still the same amount. There's not more questions on axial. Okay. They're very evenly distributed. The questions are very evenly distributed throughout the whole course, and also it might be like the AMP1 final was not in sequence. The questions were like sort of out of sequence. So here too, the questions will probably be out of sequence, but by now that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll just start for every joint, and I'll start with the hip joint, and the main actions. I'll go through the muscles that perform that action, the ones you really need to know. I'm leaving a lot of ones out. I'm leaving a lot of muscles out. So these are the ones that'll come up in, so I'm teaching towards the final, basically. Okay, that's the rule here. I'm leaving a lot of stuff out intentionally and teaching to exactly what you need to know. Okay, so I'll do flexors of the hip. And actually I won't try to, the reason I'm not using the iPad is that it would take an extra 2 hours. That's the only reason. If you want to follow stuff on iPad, that's totally okay. But if I use it with all the restarting and everything and going off, it'll take me till 7 o'clock. So that's the reason I'm not using it. So for flexors of the hip, the deep flexors are the iliopsoas group. And so, but basically that's psoas major and iliacus. Psoas minor is not a hip flexor. So basically, psoas major, iliacus are the two hip flexors from the deep ones. And then the superficial three come to like a point near ASIS, rectus femoris, sartorius, tensor fasciae latae. And that's really all you need to know for hip flexors. That's really about 5 muscles, even though we did a lot. Oh, actually, I'll add 2 more. I'm leaving a lot of stuff out intentionally.
You can talk slow a little bit, so as, and then what we have again.
Oh yeah, I said it very fast. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So it's psoas major, iliacus, and then the superficial rectus femoris, sartorius, and tensor fasciae latae. And the only 2 I would add, because sometimes they ask a gluteus medius or gluteus minimus question, and gluteus medius can do everything except ADD, it can do everything else. So I would put gluteus medius and minimus under hip flexion. So I would just add gluteus medius and gluteus minimus to hip flexion. Okay. And for hip extension, it's basically the big 4. I'll add a couple. But the big 4 muscles that are in the notes for hip extension are gluteus maximus and the 3 hamstrings. So basically hip extensors are gluteus maximus and the 3 hamstrings. That means biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. So gluteus maximus, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. Those are the main extensors of the hip, but I would add medius, not minimus. Minimus doesn't extend according to our notes, so, but I would add gluteus medius. So for hip extension, add gluteus medius and the very deep adductor magnus. The one adductor, once in a while that comes up. Sometimes I've seen the question, which muscle can both flex and extend the hip? So the anterior part of magnus is a hip flexor, even though I didn't list it because adductors probably won't come up that way on the test, but just be aware it's a hip extensor. Adductor magnus is a hip extensor. So there was the big 4, and then I added basically the 2 muscles that do almost everything, gluteus medius and adductor magnus. So the main ones, but added gluteus medius and adductor magnus that do almost everything. Medius does everything except ADD, and magnus does everything except the ABD. Magnus, adductor magnus. It's an adductor, does everything except AB, abduction. And then I'll do abductors of the hip. I'll do the abductors. And now the 2 big ones, the 2 main ones are gluteus medius, this is for AB, gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. Medius and minimus. But now we start adding a few others that might come up in double action questions. So gluteus maximus actually is probably the only muscle that both abs and adds, because the upper fibers AB, the lower fibers ADD. So you put in the ab column, put maximus, that'll be the 3rd muscle put in that column. And then the one that comes up in double action, which muscle can abduct and laterally rotate? Of the 6 deep lateral rotators, piriformis can ab, because it comes over the top. So this is still ab, add piriformis. add piriformis. Okay, and then from the flexors, add TFL, because they might have which muscle can flex, medially rotate, and abduct, and that's unusual. They probably won't have triple action, but TFL can ab, and then the trickiest one, it probably won't come up, but you might have had it. Sartorius can also abduct. So the ones so there's a lot of abductors. There's a lot of abs, and it was gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, gluteus maximus, piriformis, and then I added TFL and sartorius. I added TFL and sartorius. So there's a lot of abductors. ADD is much shorter a group. Not shorter, but easier. Because the only ones that really come up on the final are the 5 medial compartment, the 5 ads, the 5 adductor muscles. And so I'll do the layers here, since once in a while there's a layer question. The first layer of the medial compartment is pectineus, adductor longus, and gracilis. So I'm under the ADD of the hip, ADD of the hip, and the first layer, the first 3 are pectineus, ADD, adductor longus, ADD, and gracilis, long one, ADD. Second layer, kind of not really shown, but it's adductor brevis, adductor brevis, also ADD. And then the third and deepest layer is adductor magnus, ADD, adductor magnus, adducts. So basically, know the layers, but that's the 5 famous adductors. They're the ones that ADD. The only other 2 you need to be aware of, because once in a while it's a question, which muscle can ab and add? The only muscle that can both ab and add is gluteus maximus. So we added maximus to the abs, and now we'll add it to the ads. We'll add it to the adductors, gluteus maximus. And the last one, just like piriformis can laterally rotate up to 6 deep, piriformis and the go-go queens, piriformis can ab, because it comes over the top. The last one, the lowest one, quadratus femoris, comes inferior to the hip, so it tends to ADD. So of the 6 deep lateral rotators, they all laterally rotate, but the piriformis can also AB, and the quadratus femoris can also ADD. So basically, it's the 5 main adductors, and we added gluteus maximus and quadratus femoris. Okay. And the next one is medial rotation of the hip. And I need to tell you something about the ads, the 5 ads. In class, sometimes they're taught, some of them are taught as medial rotators, some of them are taught as lateral rotators. It's controversial. So even though, just be aware that they all rotate except gracilis, but they're not on the test as rotators. So don't worry, do they medially or laterally rotate? Because different books say different things. And it depends on position. So they're not going to be on the test for medial and lateral rotation. That's the adductors. Don't worry about them. So the only medial rotation muscles that are in play would be the big 3 for medial rotation. And they're all kind of anterior and oblique a little bit. TFL, gluteus medius, and then the muscle deep to it, gluteus minimus. Those are generally the only medial rotators that'll be on the test as medial rotators. TFL, then gluteus medius, which is just behind it. Gluteus medius can do a lot of things, but it can medially rotate. And then minimus is just deep to medius, does the same stuff mostly. So the big three for medial rotation, and I'll give you two more, but those are really the main three that are emphasized, would be TFL, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. Once in a while, they'll have which muscles can extend and medially rotate. It's hard to put this in a question, but I would be aware that the two semis can also medially rotate the hip. The medial, easiest way to remember it is that the medial hamstrings can medially rotate. They can medially rotate the hip and the knee, but knee medial rotation, knee rotation questions are generally not on the test actually. But just be aware that semitendinosus and semimembranosus are slight, but they count as medial rotators. So it was the big three. The three main medial rotators are TFL, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. But you add the two semis to medial rotation. Okay. Now for lateral rotation of the hip, everything else, there's a lot of lateral rotators. There's a ton of lateral rotators. So I'll do the extensor, I'll do the posterior ones first. There's no order here, but so for lateral rotation, it's maximus, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, not minimus. So it's maximus, medius, and this all 6 deep lateral rotators, but just know the names, piriformis and the go-go queens. I'm sure everyone knows that. So all of them, the thing they have in common is they all laterally rotate the hip. So basically, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and the 6 deep lateral rotators. So that's already about 8 muscles, but 2 of them are gluteus, and the other, the 6 deep. Then add the lateral hamstring is the slight lateral rotator, biceps femoris. So after maximus medius and the 6 deep, add biceps femoris. Okay, we're not finished. And then the 2 iliopsoas that move the hip, psoas major and across the hip joint, and iliacus also laterally rotate. The kind of question you would get for them would be which muscles can flex and laterally rotate the hip. And actually there are 3 muscles totally that can flex and laterally rotate. They would be psoas major, iliacus, and sartorius because it cuts the other way. Usually anterior oblique go this way and they immediately rotate. Sartorius goes the other way, but at this point I wouldn't be, everyone's clear, sartorius is a lateral rotator. Sartorius kind of breaks the anterior oblique rule. It's a lateral rotator. So the 3 flexors of the hip that can laterally rotate would be psoas major, iliacus, and sartorius. I think that's it. So that's a lot of lateral rotators. You had 2 gluteus, you had 6 deep, but that's easy, it's one group, that's 8. Then you had psoas major, iliacus makes 10, and sartorius makes 11, but 6 of them are just 6 deep lateral rotators. That's easy to remember, rather than you just know all of them laterally rotate.
And biceps femoris? And biceps femoris?
Oh, I left that one out. You're right. That makes even, that's 11. Not sure is that 11, but that's and add I forgot biceps femoris the second time around. So add biceps femoris. Okay. So that finishes the hip joint, and after that it's like the rest of it takes 5 minutes. Even in class, the hip joint takes it took like 2 weeks actually, or it felt like 2 weeks. I'm not sure if it took 4 classes, but the hip joint takes a long time because there's actually 22 muscles. If you count the 6 deep lateral rotators as individuals, that would make 22 muscles, although we tend to study them more as a group. Okay. So the knee, as complicated as the hip is action-wise, the knee is simple. The knee is one of the easiest joints to remember, don't worry about medial lateral rotation. I've never seen questions on that of the knee. On the hip, plenty, but on the knee, I haven't seen, because it's very slight. It's not emphasized. So for the knee, the 4 extensors are the 4 quads and nothing else.
Can you say again, D for the knee?
Yeah, for the knee, now we finished the hip, so I'm going to the knee joint, which only 2 categories, because it's a hinge for the most part, extensors of the knee and flexors of the knee. But it's easier to do extensors first, because it's like very one group, nothing else. So for extension of the knee, it's the 4 quadriceps muscle, and I'm gonna make a little other point, but so just know the 4 quads. They're all 4 extend the knee. Rectus femoris, I'll come back to that. That's a 2 joint. It flexes the hip and extends the knee. In case that's a very standard question. Which muscle can flex the hip and extend the knee? But if you knew that it was a hip flexor, well, that would help, but generally you can figure that out, because it would have to be, typically the choices would be which muscle can flex hip, extend knee. The choices are usually A, vastus medialis, B, vastus lateralis, C, vastus intermedius, D, rectus femoris. So it's the only one that even moves the hip among the quads. So for flex hip, extend knee, that's a very standard 2 action question. Which muscle, you probably had that ready. Which muscle can flex the hip and extend the knee? Once they say extend the knee, you know it's got to be a quad. And then the vastus muscles, 3 of them are 1 joint quads, no action at the hip. Only rectus femoris is 2 joint, and it definitely flexes the hip and extends the knee. So the 4 knee extensors are rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and the deeper quad, vastus intermedius. That's it.
You said what? Repeat all that again, I'm sorry?
The 4 quads?
The 4 quads, yeah.
Yeah. Rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and vastus intermedius. Are you here for the review?
Myology?
Yeah.
Myology class?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's a lot of classes going on.
Okay.
This one's free, but if you want to go to the others, just pay me a little price. No, just kidding. No, this is myology review.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. If you need
So finish 5 o'clock, right?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's the 4 quads. Those are the extensors of the knee. Now the point I wanted to make is that test-wise, because it's controversial, you might have learned, some people do learn, and it's in the notes, that TFL can extend the knee. But it's not, whether it can or not is problematical, so it won't be on the test, as TFL on the test is only going to be a hip muscle. The knee extension will not be an issue on the final, okay? So just the 4 quads. Just the 4 quads for extension of the knee.
Can you repeat again for 4 quads? For the muscle name?
Oh, rectus femoris,
Yep.
vastus medialis, vastus medialis,
Yep.
vastus lateralis,
Yes.
and vastus intermedius. The deep quad. Those 4 extend hip, extend knee, nothing else. Now, for flexors of the knee, there's a ton of them, but here's how I remember them. First of all, if a muscle crosses the knee joint and it's not one of the 4 quads, and you're unsure, does it flex the knee or extend? If it's a quad, it extends the knee. But if you know, let's say you know sartorius crosses knee, gracillus, and you weren't sure, they're automatically flexors if they're not a quad. So everything else that crosses the knee is pushed back behind the quads. The quads take up all the space, so you can almost see that here. The other muscles are pushed back, but everything else is a knee flexor. Everything but the four quads flexes the knee. Now here's how I remember that. If I need to write stuff down here, I will. So it's the three hamstrings flex the knee. That's biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. The three hamstrings, biceps femoris, they definitely flex knee. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Then add the pes anserine. There's often a question, which are part of the pes anserine group, or all are pes anserine group except, everyone knows the pes anserine group?
I'm always like a little gray in that area.
Oh, that's good, because that's the gray matter. That means if you're gray, you'll probably remember it.
I hope so.
Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay, so, okay. I'm not going to backtrack to the extensors. We already know it's the four quads. This is the flexors of the knee. This is how, I'm going to put them slightly out of order for a reason, but you'll see. I'm putting membranosus before tendinosus. There's actually four groups within this. And the hamstring group, that's clear cut. And then the pes anserine group, but there's overlap because semitendinosus is in the hamstrings and it's in the pes anserine. So silly goose steps, but anyway, semitendinosus sartorius gracilis, know that because it's often a pes anserine question. That's the pes anserine group, semitendinosus sartorius gracilis. And that's the thigh muscles that flex the knee. But in the lower leg, or the posterior leg, the group of two, gastroc and its little helper, gastroc and plantaris, will flex the knee and plantar flex. They're the only two muscles in the body, in case that comes up, that can flex knee and plantar flex ankle. The only two muscles that can flex the knee and plantar flex the ankle is the two posterior leg, gastrocnemius and plantaris. And then the very deep popliteus is the only one joint muscle of the knee flexors. The first group up to here, these are hip and knee. These are actually two joint hip and knee muscles, hip and knee. And then gastroc and plantaris are knee and ankle. And popliteus is the only one joint muscle of those 8. And it's a specialist, in case they ever have which muscle initiates, the answer is always popliteus. It initiates from standing, fully extended position. It would initiate knee flexion. So that's how I organize them. Hamstrings, pes anserine with the overlap, then the combo gastroc and little helper plantaris, and lastly popliteus, which initiates knee flexion. But I would know that. I would know that's the knee flexors. The knee extensors is much easier, just the 4 quads. And you'll know those. Once you study this, you know it's the 4 quads, the 3 vastus muscles, and rectus femoris. Extend knee, nothing else extends. Everything else is a lot of knee flexors. Okay. And that finishes knee. We go to ankle. And the category that's similar to flexors of the knee, not movement-wise, but because there's tons of muscles, is the plantar flexors of the ankle. So I'll maybe I should draw a chart just for plantar flexors. But actually, probably easier if I just say it. And then I'll name the muscles. The way I remember plantar flexors is the entire posterior leg, except popliteus because it doesn't go anywhere near the ankle. But everything else, the entire posterior leg and the entire lateral leg compartment, which is proneus longus and proneus brevis. So that winds up being that winds up being 8 muscles. There are 6 from posterior leg, and then the 2 large peroneus muscles, proneus longus and proneus brevis. And so the 6 posterior leg muscles, I'll go layers here. Gastrocnemius, the first layer by itself. So this is for plantar flexion. The column is plantar flexors of ankle. So I'm working on plantar flexors. So within the posterior compartment, it's gastrocnemius, plantaris. The second layer, gastrocnemius is the only first layer muscle of the posterior compartment. The 2 second layer muscles are plantaris soleus. So the 2 second layer muscles, also plantar flex, plantaris and soleus. And popliteus we leave out. So Tom, Dick, and Harry are the 3rd layer, deep to soleus. And I've seen the question, which muscles are deep to soleus? And it's usually a combo, Tom, it's usually tibialis posterior, they have A, B, they have flexor digitorum longus, C, flexor hallucis longus, D, all of them. So it's all of them. They're not shown in this picture, but the 3 very deep muscles, deep to soleus, are tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, and flexor hallucis longus. So they all plantar flex because they're all crossing the ankle joint posteriorly. So basically, it's gastroc, plantaris soleus, Tom, Dick, and Harry. The 6 muscles of the posterior leg that plantar flex are gastrocnemius, plantaris soleus, tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus.
And Tom, Dick, and Harry are deep to soleus.
Yeah, Tom, Dick, and Harry are deep to soleus. Tom, Dick, and Harry are deep to soleus. And then that's 6 muscles of the posterior leg. Add, because they cross the 2 peroneus muscles, peroneus longus and brevis, cross behind the lateral malleolus. If they cross in front, they dorsi, but they cross posterior. Peroneus longus and peroneus brevis cross posterior, making them, they will plantar flex. So to these 6, add peroneus longus and peroneus brevis.
By any chance, is it gonna be on the test
Fibularis,
yeah, that's how it was at the, cadaver viewing.
it was on the test as fibularis?
No, I'm
No,
asking you.
okay, yeah, okay. By request only. You must put it in writing at least a week. If you want the name fibularis to be there instead of peroneus, put it in writing, or you can email Erica, and on your customized test, I'm sorry, it won't be on the test. We still use the old-fashioned peroneus longus, peroneus brevis, peroneus tertius. On the final, it'll be that name, not the new name, which is confusing maybe.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
So then that took care of plantar flexion.
Okay.
For dorsiflexion, it's a little bit like the 4 quads, nothing else for knee extension. But it's the 4 anterior compartment muscles, nothing else. Because they cross anteriorly, the 4 anterior compartment muscles cross the ankle anteriorly and pull up on the foot and dorsiflex. So the only 4 dorsiflexors are tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum longus. Those are the superficial 2, in case they ask. The superficial 2 that dorsiflex are tibialis anterior and extensor digitorum longus. The 2 deep ones, second layer, that also dorsiflex are extensor hallucis longus, and a very deep peroneus tertius. So the 2 deep ones that dorsiflex are extensor hallucis longus or hallucis longus and peroneus tertius. Okay, so 4, 2 superficial tibialis anterior and extensor digitorum longus, 2 deep extensor hallucis longus and peroneus tertius. Okay. I don't need to do toe muscles because they probably wouldn't ask you because it's in the name. Like extensor hallucis extends the big toe. Extensor digitorum longus extends the 4 toes, 2, 3, 4, 5. Flexor hallucis flexes the big toe, the name tells you, and flexor digitorum longus flexes toes 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can't really, you don't have to worry about. It's in the name. But now there are 5 inverters of the foot. How to organize them is the key. So this is the way, there's 5 inverters. They come up in double action questions or just pure inversion, but from the anterior compartment, it would be tibialis, from the front, it would be anterior, tibialis anterior and extensor hallucis longus. So you take 2 from the anterior, tibialis anterior and extensor hallucis longus. Tibialis anterior and extensor hallucis longus from the anterior compartment. And then from the posterior compartment, Tom, Dick, and Harry. If you know that mnemonic, how many people are okay with that mnemonic? It's very helpful, but if you don't know, you don't worry about it. But they don't use that terminology in a finals question, but it's just easy. But anyway, I'll say them. The Tom, Dick, and Harry muscles all invert. All 3 of them are deep to soleus, all 3 invert. Tibialis posterior, that's Tom. Tibialis posterior. Flexor digitorum longus, that's Dick, flexor digitorum longus, and flexor hallucis longus, that's Harry, flexor hallucis longus. So basically tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, and flexor hallucis longus all invert. So Tom, Dick, and Harry invert, and then tibialis anterior and extensor hallucis longus also invert. So there's 5 inverters. They're not gonna ask how many,
Wait,
but
I just got lost, I'm sorry.
Tom, Dick, Henry, tibialis anterior, and
extensor hallucis or hallucis, because that goes to the
Oh.
big toe, so it's weak for inversion, but it's going, anything that goes towards the medial arch will tend to pull up on that, and that's inversion. Any muscle that kind of is angled like extensor digitorum, we're gonna do in a second, anything angled towards the lateral arch tends to evert. Anything angled towards the medial arch tends to invert. Don't use Tom, Dick, and Harry this way. They just, don't worry about mechanical reasons for Tom, Dick, and Harry. Just know they invert. Tom, Dick, and Harry invert. But did you get lost somewhere?
I did, so for the posterior compartment, we have tibialis posterior, right?
Right.
Flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus. Then we also have tibialis anterior, and the 2 extensors,
Just one.
just hallucis.
Yeah.
That was
That's it. That makes 5. So 2 anterior ones. The tricky one is hallucis will invert. And we'll see in a minute that the digitorum, the extensor digitorum, everts. That's not clear from pictures, but I'll show why right now. But anyway, that's the 5 inverters, before I confuse you and do, but the everters are easier to remember name-wise. Much easier, actually.
Okay.
Okay, so I can go to eversion of the foot?
Yeah.
Only 4. There's only 4, but we don't ask numbers, how many inverters would be, we could have, I lobbied for an all number final. Like every question, how many extensors of the knee, how many flexors of the knee, how many, I lobbied for that type of question, but it was turned down, for good reason. But what do you know if you just remember a bunch of numbers? Okay.
Eversion, you said that there's.
Eversion is easy. The 3 peroneus muscles. If you want to be an everter, your parents should have named you Peroneus. A good reason to name somebody. But test-wise, yeah, the 3, if your name is Peroneus
Longus, brevis, and
and tertius, yeah, doesn't matter which compartment for just an eversion question, the 3 peroneus muscles evert, because they're all angled towards the lateral side. So the 3 peroneus muscles evert, add the odd one, the hard one is, but just extensor digitorum longus. Yeah, extensor, so it's the 3, for eversion of the foot, it's the 3 peroneus muscles and extensor digitorum longus. That's it. The reason it everts, don't worry about, but because the insertion tendon of extensor digitorum longus angles this oblique to the lateral side. It's hard to see that in pictures, but in palpation hands-on classes, you can see it on people, that it angles this way and it tends to evert. The tendon, before it splits into 4 branches, the insertion tendon of extensor digitorum as it crosses the ankle is oblique this way, and that makes it a weak everter. So that's the reason, but don't worry about that. But so for eversion, it's the 3 peroneus muscles, longus, brevis, tertius, and add extensor digitorum longus, and that's everything for eversion. Okay, so I can finish, well, I'll do the upper extremity is easier in a lot of ways. The hip joint is, there's so many muscles for each action. That's not true anywhere else really, except for knee flexion. It's usually just 3 or 4 muscles. Once you get to flexors and extensors of the wrist, but their names, they're easier to remember because they're more of a group thing rather than a lot of individuals. But okay, so I'll start with scapular muscles. And, let's see. Oh yeah, here's the question. I know my class, we have a test tomorrow on scapular and shoulder muscles. Okay, so if you have any questions later, I'll answer those separately, but,
Scapular stabilization we have tomorrow.
yeah,
Exam number 5, this is scapular stabilization.
yeah, scapular stabilization,
Stabilization.
and also all the shoulder muscles. It's
Oh.
all of them, like, we reviewed that.
Mhm.
Anyway, so it's really, yeah, how many people, is your test this week on scapula, or did you already have tested on that?
Yeah.
See, we
Yeah, but on the
lost the
net.
class, you did. That's why we're a test behind. We're not behind in material, but we're a test behind, because we lost the class because of that, 37-inch snowstorm that shut down the city. Okay, so, school was closed for a day. But, anyway, it didn't affect, anatomy or myology for other, but anyway, so your test probably coming up this week is it elbow and wrist muscles?
No, we did that already with the muscles of the neck.
The neck.
It's coming up.
Oh, so you had that one too? Oh, okay, anyway, so that's, okay, so we're gonna, anyway, so we just have them in a different place, but it won't matter.
We're still equal. We're in the same school.
Yeah, we covered all the material.
Either way, at the
Actually,
end
we
of the day, we're
finished,
gonna
the
know
material.
everything.
I think we're
So
all
good.
in the same place, material-wise. Everyone finished upper extremity muscles, but you started axial, right? You must have, because neck
Yeah,
muscles.
we
are-
started
oh,
that
okay.
already.
Okay, I'll start axial in this class, review-wise, even though we didn't do it, so that's the problem. But anyway, I'm gonna do scapula stabilizers, and right now, and I'll do the actions. The actions are relatively straightforward, which muscles do which. So for retraction, it's basically the entire trapezius and the rhomboids, that's it. So whether it's upper trap, middle trap, lower trap, all of trapezius retracts. And now rhomboids, we don't distinguish test-wise rhomboid minor, rhomboid major, we just say rhomboids. On the final, as probably on your test, it's just gonna say rhomboids. So trapezius, all of it retracts, and the rhomboids retract, meaning pull the scapula towards the vertebral column. That's it, trapezius and rhomboids, that's easy. For protraction, equally easy, you have to have muscles here that'll pull the scapula forward, so it's the
That's
large,
really amazing.
for protraction of scapula, it's just serratus anterior, and then the smaller pec minor. There are only two protractors.
Can you repeat for the name for the muscle again, for action?
Which ones, protractors?
Mhm.
Yeah, protractors, because protraction means you're pulling the scapula forward. You're pulling the scapula forward. So so a rib cage muscle will tend to pull scapula forward, and serratus anterior and pec minor both pull the scapula anteriorly and protract. So there's really two retractors, the entire trapezius. So this is much easier than the hip joint. So there's two retractors, the entire traps and the rhomboids. Traps and rhomboids retract, serratus anterior and pec minor protract. So the only two protractors are serratus anterior and pec minor. Okay. It's gonna be almost 2 for every action. So elevation, it's just upper trap and levator scapula. For elevation, it's just upper trap and just 2. Levator means elevate. So upper trap and levator scapula are the only 2 elevators. Upper trap and levator scapula are the only 2 elevators. To press, would be, if upper trap, okay, would be, those tables, be careful as you read, this is a dangerous, this is room became a
Pull the
dangerous.
bottom out.
I think, you could like, yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, that's good. So elevate is upper trap and levator scapula, upper trap and levator scapula. Depress would be lower trap and pec minor. The only two depressors are lower trap and pec minor. The only two depressors of scapula are lower trap and pec minor, lower trap and pec minor. And for upward rotation of scapula, okay. The tricky one here is lower trap. Upper trap upwardly rotates. The upper trap will definitely upwardly rotate, but lower trap, because most of the fibers attach on the medial border side on the spine, so they pull down. The lower trap tends to pull down here. The name would tell you lower trap would, actually you can't tell from the name, but it upwardly rotates. So if they just put trapezius as an answer for upward rotation, they could put trapezius, or they could put upper trapezius, lower trapezius. Middle trap's only retract. The middle trap is a pure retractor. It only pulls retraction. But the upper trap upwardly rotates, and the lower trap also upwardly rotates. That's a tricky one. Both upper trapezius and lower trapezius upwardly rotate. That's the only tricky thing in all of this, that the upper trap and the lower trap both upwardly rotate.
Show it to me one more time with your hand, I can memorize it.
Lower trap?
Right, so upper pulls it
Well,
up.
upper just is direct. Upper
Upper.
goes this way to kind of like here, and it just pulls up. It tilts upward.
Right,
Lower trap, most of the fibers attach on the spine near the vertebral border. So when they pull down this way. This side tilts down, but the side you key off of seesaws up. Like the way my hand, this is lower trap, it pulls down obliquely, and can you see this side tends to rotate upward?
okay.
So both upper trap and lower trap are upward rotators. And you add, and then you add serratus anterior. This is still upward rotation. Serratus anterior tends to protract and upwardly rotate. They go together. Protraction and upward rotation tend to go together, and serratus will protract and upwardly rotate. Serratus, that's a common double action question. Serratus anterior will protract and upwardly rotate. Serratus will upwardly rotate. That's the third one in addition to the two traps. And downward rotation, both levator scapula and rhomboids, they will pull up on the vertebral side. But anyway, and then they make the glenoid fossa lateral side tilt down. It's indirect, but the two, now we're on downward rotation, also three muscles. The downward rotators are levator scapula, rhomboids, because they will pull up on the vertebral side, making this side tilt down. They pull up here, and then the side you key off of tilts down, so they're downward rotators. Levator scapula and rhomboids are downward rotators, and pec minor tilts down directly. So it's the three downward rotators are levator scapula, rhomboids, and pectoralis minor. Pectoralis minor is the third downward rotator. And because I'm going to forget later, the common double antagonist question in the scapular muscles, which muscle is total antagonist to serratus anterior? serratus anterior will protract and upwardly rotate. Which muscle is a total antagonist? I'll give choices. Which muscle is a total antagonist? A total antagonist to serratus anterior. A, trapezius, B, pec minor, C, rhomboids, D, all of them.
Boy.
Yeah, the famous combo here is rhomboids, serratus anterior, because they actually have the same insertion, opposite directions. Serratus anterior will protract and upwardly rotate. Rhomboids will retract and downwardly rotate. Serratus will protract and upwardly rotate, and then the rhomboids will retract and downwardly rotate. Serratus protracts, upwardly rotates. Rhomboids will retract and downwardly rotate. So rhomboids, that's always there in some type of question. The total antagonists of this group are rhomboids and serratus anterior. And actually that finished all the scapular muscles. Oh, I'm leaving out two issues, two things. Prime movers, I'll do all the prime movers. There's very few on the test, maybe 2 or 3 prime mover questions. I'll do them after I finish all the actions. I'll do prime movers in one shot. And then the second half of this review, I'll do the origins, insertions. I'm leaving them out intentionally because I mix them with the actions. It's very, in a review you might know that's totally confusing. So I'll do the origins, insertions separate, the ones you really need to know. I'll do those after we, before you leave. Second half of the review, I'll do those. Okay, so I think that finished, except for subclavius, which doesn't fit into those actions. So just know subclavius depresses and stabilizes clavicle. Basically, it goes from first rib to under, right here, and it tends to depress and stabilize clavicle and SC joint. Usually there's not a question on it, but it basically depresses and stabilizes clavicle. Subclavius will depress and stabilize clavicle. Okay, then I'm going to glenohumeral or shoulder joint muscles. Glenohumeral or shoulder joint. Same, now here there's 8 categories, but there's not that many muscles because we have to also do horizontal. It's the 6, same, it's a ball and socket joint, so it has the same 6 actions as the hip joint. But we add horizontal add, and we add at the end, it's just very, very straightforward, horizontal add, I'll add that at the end. So for flexors of the glenohumeral, those are anterior muscles. There's only, actually, this is for, okay. There's 4 flexors, one of which, when I did the columns in my class, I left out because tomorrow it's not in play, but it'll be in play on Tuesday's test, so you might as well, I'll give it now. But the 3 main flexors of the shoulder are anterior deltoid, pec major, all of it, pectoralis major, anterior deltoid, the smaller coracobrachialis, and the 4th one is biceps brachii. That's the one I probably didn't put in the chart. Actually, yeah, I didn't put that one in the chart because we weren't doing the elbow muscles yet. So the 4 flexors of the shoulder are anterior deltoid. It's anterior deltoid, pec major, coracobrachialis, and then it's a 3-joint, it's a 3-action muscle. Biceps brachii also flexes. So you add to those 3 main ones, you add biceps brachii, that's the 4th flexor of the shoulder, because it does cross the shoulder anteriorly. Okay, for extensors of the shoulder, they'll be very similar. The 3 main ones are posterior deltoid extends. These are posterior muscles. So the main extensors of the shoulder are posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, the large muscle that goes around, but that will extend. So it's posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, and then the little helper, latissimus little helper, is teres major. Those are the three main extensors. Posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, and its helper, teres major. But now, you added biceps to the flexors of the shoulder, you add triceps, at least the long head, but the whole muscle will probably, if they say which are extensors of the shoulder, they'll probably just put triceps and it counts, because even if one part does. So the fourth extensor of the shoulder will be triceps brachii. The fourth extensor will be triceps brachii. So it was posterior deltoid, latissimus dorsi, teres major, and you add triceps brachii. Those are the four extensors. For ADD, it's two anterior adductors would be pec major adducts and coracobrachialis adducts. So the two from the flexors group that adduct are pec major, coracobrachialis. Pec major adducts, coracobrachialis adducts.
These two are anterior.
So there?
These two are anterior
Flexion.
Yeah, they're,
for adductors.
for adduction, the way it works out is there are two flexors that adduct, that means anterior muscles, and there are two extensors or posterior muscles that ADD. They kind of match each other. So the first two that are flexors of the shoulder that also ADD are pec major and coracobrachialis. Pec major and coracobrachialis adduct. And then you add latissimus and its helper teres major are the extensors that adduct. So the two posterior extensor muscles that also ADD, adduct, are latissimus dorsi and teres major. Latissimus dorsi and teres major also ADD. Now test-wise, even though they're not really the same, test-wise they are. If you adduct here, I'm sure this was emphasized, or if you adduct posteriorly, test-wise and book-wise, they're both called ADD. So it makes it easier. This pec major and coracobrachialis adduct, but also latissimus and teres major move the arm towards the midline, they both adduct. That's it for ADD. For abduct shoulder, this is actually fairly straightforward. If they just have middle deltoid, it's a pure ab. Middle deltoid that's all it does. But if they have entire deltoid, that's the prime mover. If the entire muscle at deltoid contracts, you get ab. If just the middle deltoid contracts, you get ab. Either way. So middle deltoid would be an answer. Entire deltoid will ab. Either way. The third one is the initiator, because in anatomical position, deltoid doesn't have good angle. So just know the initiator, not the prime mover, but the muscle that initiates AB is rotator cuff supraspinatus, initiates ab. So if they say which muscle initiates the abduction, you assume arms by size or anatomical, the answer would be supraspinatus. So the three abs are middle deltoid, entire deltoid, and then the initiator, supraspinatus. That takes care of ab. So just those three for AB. Now, medial rotation, there's lots of muscles. Actually, there's 5. There's a lot of muscles that medially rotate the shoulder. For medial rotation of the shoulder, it's pec major and anterior deltoid. They're both anterior and oblique. So pec major medially rotates, anterior deltoid medially rotates. So pec major and anterior deltoid medially rotate. And even though they're posterior muscles, both latissimus dorsi and teres major go through the armpit and wrap around to the intertubercular groove. So when they contract, they twist. The muscles twist, and then they medially rotate because of that. So they're extensors, but they medially rotate. So it's pec major, anterior deltoid for medial rotation, but you add latissimus dorsi and its little helper teres major also medially rotate. Latissimus dorsi and teres major also medially rotate. That's 4. Then number 5 is the pure medial rotator, the deep rotator cuff subscapularis. So the deep rotator cuff muscle, subscapularis, that's all it does, but it's very strong. So subscapularis is the 5th medially rotator. 2 flexors medially rotate, pec major, anterior deltoid. 2 extensors medially rotate, latissimus and teres major. Then the 5th one is the pure medial rotator, that would be subscapularis. Subscapularis is, it's only action. Medial, so that's 5 medial rotators. And lateral rotators is just 3. It's a smaller category, but it's posterior deltoid. They're all posterior and oblique. Posterior deltoid laterally rotates. And then infraspinatus, rotator cuff laterally rotates. Then the muscle that's almost part of it, teres minor, also laterally rotates. So there's 3 lateral rotators: posterior deltoid, infraspinatus, and teres minor. So the 3 lateral rotators are posterior deltoid, infraspinatus, teres minor. This is a mnemonic I just picked. That probably won't help for that, but that's probably not a good mnemonic. Picked. Posterior deltoid, infraspinatus, teres minor, because the T could be teres major, that's why it's not so good. Okay.
Would you mind going back to abduction for 1 second? Because I think you said there was 3, but I didn't get the 3.
Oh, 2 of them have the same name.
Okay.
For AB,
Uh-huh.
abduction, it would be middle deltoid and then entire deltoid.
Okay.
So it's almost the same.
And
But
that's-
middle deltoid, that's all it does, is ab. Entire deltoid does a lot more, but basically, middle deltoid, entire deltoid, and the 3rd is supraspinatus, which initiates.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's 6 shoulder actions. The last 2, well, they come up sometimes. Everyone knows this is horizontal ADD. Only 2 muscles can do it, pec major, and you can almost feel them, and anterior deltoid. So the 2 muscles that can horizontally add are pec major, anterior deltoid. Just pec major, anterior deltoid. And the only muscle listed that can horizontal ab is posterior deltoid. Others might look like they do it, but test-wise, just posterior deltoid. For horizontal ab, it's only posterior deltoid. So pec major, anterior deltoid for horizontal ADD, and only posterior deltoid for horizontal ab. Only posterior deltoid for horizontal ab. Okay.
Wait, horizontal eye was pec major and which other one?
Oh,
Anterior deltoid.
and, yeah, pec major and anterior deltoid for horizontal ADD. Pec major and anterior deltoid. Let's see. Now, we'll go to, that finishes shoulder. The rest of the upper extremity is is somewhat straightforward actually. But for flexors of the elbow, like the knee, we only do, there are 4 flexors, and then there's just 2 extensors for the elbow. This is not, the pronator, supinatus we do separately. there's overlap. Some of the flexors will supinate, pronate of the elbow, but right now we're just doing elbow flexors. And I'll just list the 4 muscles, one of which when I did the chart, I didn't do the chart yet, so. The 4 flexors of the elbow are the big 3, biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis. So the big 3 flexors of the elbow are biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis. You add the weaker one, but it comes up in test questions, pronator teres, because it does cross anteriorly. A lot of the wrist flexors cross anteriorly, but they're never listed. They've been tested. They're negligible for elbow flexion. So the only one, because it's a proximal muscle and it has a lot of them, anyway, it has some leverage at the elbow. So pronator teres flexes the elbow. Pronator teres flexes the elbow. But the big 3, besides pronator teres, are biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis. That's the big 3. And what I might not have time for, but I'll review that tomorrow. But for now, I better say it. There's a position that goes with, forget about pronator teres and aorist position, just no elbow flexor. But for the first 3, there's a preferred, stronger position for elbow flexion. And this is not prime mover stuff. This is just in relation to itself. Biceps brachii, because origin, insertion line up best in anatomical. Biceps, strongest in relation to itself as an elbow flexor in anatomical or supinated. Biceps is at maximum strength as an elbow flexor in anatomical or supinated position. Now, brachialis inserts on the ulna, so it's not affected by forearm position. So brachialis equally strong as an elbow flexor in all forearm positions, not affected. Biceps is strongest in anatomical. You can't feel this so much on yourself, but brachialis is equally strong in all forearm positions. Don't try this when you're taking a test, because you can't really tell which muscle is operating, but brachialis is equally strong as an elbow flexor in all forearm positions. Brachialis equally strong in all forearm positions. And the way I remember the next one, brachioradialis loves neutral. It loves neutral. So position, because that's where it's at maximum strength in general. So brachioradialis, and those 2 names look alike on paper. Brachioradialis is at maximum strength as an elbow flexor in neutral position. Brachioradialis at maximum strength in neutral. Biceps, maximum anatomical. Brachialis equally strong in all positions. And brachioradialis at maximum strength in neutral position. Okay. That takes care of elbow flexion. Elbow extension, there are 20 muscles, 18 of which they didn't teach you yet. So I'm going to do them now. No. Okay. There's only 2. Triceps brachii and its little helper anconeus. Triceps is the prime mover. I'll do those in a little bit. So for elbow extension, it's easy. Triceps brachii and its little helper anconeus. Triceps, for extension of the elbow, it's just triceps and the smaller helper muscle anconeus. And that finishes elbow. Okay, any question on elbow? Okay, so we go to pronators of the form. The next, these are going to be short, small groups actually. Pronation of the form. Two main ones, and then we add a third. So for pronation, and keep in mind that for pronation, like most actions, the starting point is anatomical position, and at pronation, is equivalent to does that make sense? Pronation is like medial rotation, even though we say pronation.
Yeah.
So they're anterior and oblique. So the two main ones are, they have both called pronator. Pronator teres, pronator quadratus are the two co-prime movers, as it turns out. So the two strong pronators are pronator teres, pronator quadratus. The two big ones for pronation are pronator teres, pronator quadratus. But if you're in neutral, no, if you're in anatomical, brachioradialis loves neutral. It'll pronate to neutral only, but it counts. So if we had a question, you assume anatomical, which of the following muscles can pronate to form? A, I've seen this question, pronator teres, B, pronator quadratus, C, brachioradialis, D, all of them, E, A, and B only. Which can pronate if you start this way? Would be all of them, because even though it just goes to here, brachioradialis still pronates. So brachioradialis is an answer to a pronation question. Even though it's just partial, it's still an answer. So the three pronators then, pronator teres, pronator quadratus, add brachioradialis.
So this is neutral and not anatomical, is not neutral?
Oh, that's anatomical.
Right. And this is neutral?
That's neutral.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's, brachioradialis only goes to neutral, but it still counts as a pronator, if it's even, okay. And this is called pronated position. Pronated, neutral, anatomical, or supinated. Supinated, they usually say anatomical, but supinated and anatomical are the same. Now, supination is the same way, but there's three muscles. The big two are, this is, it won't be a factor on the test, but even if they don't say, for supination questions, assume you're starting pronated. Otherwise, if you start anatomical, you're fully supinated, you can't go anymore. So for supination questions, supination is like lateral rotation. Supination is like lateral rotation, but just, this would be the starting position, even if they don't say it. The two main supinators are biceps brachii, supinates, and then this posterior oblique muscle, very deep, supinator. That's a surprise that a muscle named supinator will supinate. Imagine if it was a pronator and they gave it that name. They would have changed the name a long time ago.
What was
so-
the first muscle? Biceps.
Oh, biceps brachii
Right.
is actually the prime mover test-wise, but I'll cover that. But for complex mechanical reasons, but biceps is a supinator. Supinator is a supinator. But if you start this way, pronated, brachioradialis will supinate to neutral. So it's number 3 in both pronation and supination. It's the only muscle that does both. Brachioradialis is the only muscle that can pronate and also supinate. Okay, so the 3 supinators were biceps brachii, supinator, and you add brachioradialis to neutral. It supinates to neutral. Okay, so I'll finish upper extremity, then we'll figure out what we're going to do next. So for wrist muscles, okay, now. I'll do it by compartment. This is the anterior-form compartment. Everything, there are 8 muscles. You don't need to know numbers here, but there's 8 muscles in the anterior-form compartment. 6 of them flex the wrist. The other 2 are the 2 pronators. They're actually in that compartment, but they don't cross the wrist and they don't flex the wrist. But the other 6 muscles of the anterior form, so all the wrist flexors are basically the anterior form muscles. The anterior form muscles are the wrist flexors. And I'll do it by layers because sometimes they ask layer questions. So layer 1 is flexor carpi ulnaris. These are all wrist flexors. All of these muscles, I'm going to have 6, there's 6 wrist flexors. The 3 of the first layer wrist flexors are flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi radialis. So the first layer of wrist flexors, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi radialis. That's the first three. The second layer is a giant muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis, that flexes the wrist, it flexes the four fingers. So the second layer muscle, which is also a wrist flexor, is the only second layer muscle. It's giant, flexor digitorum superficialis. So this flexor digitorum superficialis is also second layer and a wrist flexor. And the two third layer wrist flexors, they're two very deep muscles. Flexor digitorum profundus, which works with superficialis. So flexor digitorum profundus flexes the fingers, but it's also a wrist flexor. So the two third layer wrist flexors are flexor digitorum profundus, and if you wiggle your thumb, even though it's deep, it's so distal you can see or feel it, the flexor pollicis longus is the sixth wrist flexor. So the two deep ones of the third layer are flexor digitorum profundus, and flexor pollicis longus. Pollicis means thumb only. So that's 6 wrist flexors: flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis. The fourth is flexor digitorum superficialis. 5 is flexor digitorum profundus, and 6 is flexor pollicis longus.
Sorry, pronated teres is not part of it?
It's part of the two pronators are in your anterior forearm, but in terms of moving the wrist, they'd have to cross the wrist. And even pronator quadratus doesn't cross the wrist. Pronator teres is so far away, so they're in the anterior forearm. They usually don't ask that, but they're not wrist flexors. They don't do anything at the wrist.
I don't know why it's here.
But these, I listed them in the compartment. I was going structurally, but they're not. So there are 8 muscles in your anterior forearm. 6 of them flex the wrist. The 2 pronators don't. So the 2 pronators don't flex the wrist, but the other 6 flex the wrist. Okay. Now for extensors of the wrist, there's actually 10 muscles, in the posterior, but you only need to know the first 5 to be quite honest. Well, supinator you're going to know from supination. So of the superficial 5, is of the posterior form compartment.
We're going to call this one first layer? As superficial?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now we're going to wrist extensors. We finished wrist flexors. Wrist extensors have to be in the posterior. They have to cross the wrist posteriorly. So of the posterior compartment, there's 2 layers. The superficial 5, all of them extend the wrist. And the 5 deep, none of them extend the wrist. So you don't have to worry about them. And one of those 5 deep is supinator, which you only need to know is it's a supinator. You don't have to worry about where it is. It just supinates. But it's nowhere near the wrist joint. So the superficial 5, the only 5 muscles that extend the wrist are, all of them have a specialized action which is in the name. Extensor carpi ulnaris will be this one here. Extensor carpi ulnaris will extend the wrist. Extensor digiti minimi, this thin sliver muscle, it extends the pinky, but it also extends the wrist. So extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti minimi. Then extensor digitorum is the big one. It extends the 4 fingers, but it also extends the wrist. Name-wise, did you learn it as extensor digitorum, or did you learn it as extensor digitorum communis?
Digitorum.
Okay,
or Communis. Yeah.
did you learn communis? Okay, sorry I said. In case, I don't think they'll ever put it on the final, but it's just say, it's got two names. It's got two names. Whether they call it extensor digitorum, communis just means together, that it's doing the four fingers together. It's the same muscle. So if by any odd chance they say, I think they purposely say just extensor digitorum because that's how we teach it. But down the road, you probably will see the term name extensor digitorum communis. It's the same muscle. Extensor digitorum or extensor digitorum communis, same muscle, but it extends the wrist. And then the two radialis muscles, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and both of them radial deviate, and extensor carpi radialis longus extend the wrist. So there's five, I'll say them again. There's five wrist extensors. They would be, I go ulnar to radial, it won't really matter, but extensor carpi ulnaris extends the wrist. Extensor digiti minimi will extend the wrist. And the pinky, but that's, the name tells you the specialist, all five of them, the name tells you the specialist action. But all five extend the wrist. Then extensor digitorum extends the wrist, and extensor carpi radialis brevis will extend the wrist, and then hard to distinguish from extensor carpi radialis longus, that too extends the wrist. So it's extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digiti minimi, extensor digitorum, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and extensor carpi radialis longus. Those are the five wrist extensors. Okay, now for ulnar, on the test, they're going to say ulnar deviation. It's very simple. The two ulnaris muscles, nothing else. There might be some others that contribute, but test-wise, ulnaris name means ulnar deviation. So both flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris, both of them ulnar deviate. So you have to have ulnaris as your last name to ulnar deviate. So the two ulnar deviation muscles are flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris. That's it. So the two ulnaris muscles, flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris, ulnar deviate. Okay. It's the same idea for radial deviation. You have to have radialis as your last name to radial deviate. And there's only three radialis muscles. Flexor carpi radialis will radial deviate. So the three radial deviation muscles are flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and extensor carpi radialis longus. So it's the three radialis muscles, flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and extensor carpi radialis longus. So for ulnar deviation, it's just the two ulnaris, the way I remember it, for ulnar deviation, it's just the two ulnaris muscles, and for radial deviation, it's just the three radialis muscles. So it's in the name. Okay. And what I'll do is, this will be the last mini topic before we take a break. So I'll do all the prime movers. It's a short topic that you need to know. I'm leaving a ton of them out because they're not on the test. There's only maybe 10 or 12 that you need to know that could be on the final. Okay. I'll go in this order of the muscles. And for hip flexion, it's iliopsoas. which means psoas major iliacus. But on the test question, they probably would have iliopsoas. Because psoas minor doesn't move the hip, ends here. So anyway, the prime mover for flexion of the hip is iliopsoas. Iliopsoas, which means psoas major iliacus. That's prime mover for flexion of the hip. The only other hip action is AB. It's gluteus medius. The others are too close to call. So for AB, abduction, the prime mover, gluteus medius. For abduction, the prime mover is gluteus medius. Okay, here's the good news. For the knee, it's the quads as a group, so you can't ask it. You can't distinguish the four of them. They always work together. And for knee flexion, there's way too many muscles. It's impossible to tell prime mover for knee flexion, to be quite honest. Never listed, so you don't have to worry about the knee. So you go to the ankle, and for dorsiflexion, it's tibialis anterior just by itself. The prime mover for dorsiflexion of ankle is tibialis anterior. For dorsiflexion, it's tibialis anterior. And for plantar flexion, I guess they have tested that gastroc and soleus are equally strong. So the next three are going to be combos. For plantar flexion, it's the combo of gastroc and soleus. So the prime mover for plantar flexion is gastroc and soleus. Gastroc, soleus. And for inversion, this is how I remember it. It's the two tibialis muscles. The other three are weaker. The tibialis anterior and the very deep tibialis posterior are co-prime movers for inversion. So for inversion of the foot, it's the two tibialis muscles. Tibialis anterior and then the very deep tibialis posterior. The two tibialis muscles are co-prime movers for invert. And for evert, it's similar, peroneus longus and brevis. Not tertius. Tertius is weak in general. So the two co-prime movers for eversion of foot, it's peroneus longus and peroneus brevis are co-prime movers for eversion of the foot. And for scapular muscles, there's only one prime mover because the others are too close to call. The only prime mover in the scapular stabilizers is for protraction of scapula, it's serratus anterior. Everyone agrees pectoralis minor much weaker. So the large serratus anterior is the prime mover for protraction. The prime mover for protraction is serratus anterior. Protraction of scapula, prime mover, it's serratus anterior. And now we go to shoulder joint. Only two are clear cut that are ever listed. For flexion, it's anterior deltoid because of position and it's bulky, probably close to call, but books and our tests say the prime mover for flexion of the shoulder is, right, pure anterior almost, is anterior deltoid. For flexion of the shoulder, it's anterior deltoid. And for ab, not middle deltoid, not the initiator supraspinatus, entire deltoid. When the whole muscle contracts, you get powerful ab. So the prime mover for AB, abduction of the shoulder, is entire deltoid. Prime mover is entire deltoid. For elbow flexion, you just need to know the position of maximum, what I did before. No prime mover question, too close to call, mainly between biceps and brachialis. Elbow flexion is too close to call. Just know the position of maximum strength for each of the three that we already did. You just need to know the position, don't worry about prime mover. But for extension of elbow, it's triceps, because the little helper just helps at the end. But the prime mover for extension of elbow, almost by default, is triceps. For extension of elbow, the prime mover is triceps. And for pronationiform, it's the two pronators by name. They're considered co-prime movers. For pronationiform, it's pronatotaries, pronatoquadratus combo. So for pronation of the form, it's pronatotaries, pronatoquadratus. Pronatotaries and pronatoquadratus are the co-prime movers for pronation. Now, this one I've seen on the final many times, and it's not controversial. It's just it's confusing. It's surprising, but it's biceps. Supinator is very strong, but by virtue of its size, if they say what's the prime mover for supination, the answer you have to choose between those two. But the answer they want is biceps brachii. For supination of the form, the prime mover is biceps brachii. So for supination, prime mover is biceps brachii.
Sorry, going back to elbow flexion, you said? What, elbow flexion, prime mover?
Oh, there's no. Oh no, you're right. Elbow flexion there is no prime mover question.
Okay, thank
It's
you.
just position for each muscle.
Okay.
No prime mover question for elbow flexion. And for wrist flexion, wrist extension, too many muscles, impossible to tell. There's too many muscles bunched together, so no prime mover question for the wrist. And even though there's a co-prime mover for ulnaris, ulnar deviate, they won't ask that. They're just gonna, because there's only two muscles. So they're not gonna ask that. They're just gonna say which muscles ulnar deviate, which muscles radial deviate. No prime mover questions for wrist or fingers. And the only other prime movers, I guess I can tell you, and then when we do axial in our class next couple of days or later today a little bit, there's 4 prime movers mixed into the axial muscles. So I'll just say it, but I'm gonna write it down in detail later. The SCMs for flexion of the neck is these 2 giant SCMs. If you flex your neck and you feel just these cords that stick up from the sternum and clavicle, that's the 2 sternocleidomastoids. So for flexion of the neck, it's the sternocleidomastoid. Okay.
Can you say again?
The prime mover for flexion of the neck, did you have the term? It's sternocleidomastoid. Not only do you have to be able to spell that for the final, you have to be able to spell it backwards. I'm just kidding. I would flunk out also. So, okay, no spelling in this school anyway. So it's sternocleidomastoid for flexion of the neck. That's it for the neck. For extension of the trunk is that giant erector spinae muscle that has 3 divisions. So just for extension of the trunk, it's that primary postural muscle that we're going to do that tomorrow. It's erector spinae. For extension of the trunk, it's erector spinae. You can't tell between the abs. The obliques and rectus abdominis are very strong in flexion, so there's no prime mover for flexion of the trunk. So it's only flexion of the neck, SCM, sternocleidomastoid, and extension of the trunk, they can tell it's the primary, it's a giant muscle, erector spinae. And then for breathing, for inhale, it's that giant diaphragm muscle that we talked about as a boundary between thoracic, abdominal, pelvic. But the giant diaphragm muscle for inhale, it's the prime mover for inhalation, which you probably didn't get to that. None of us did, but when diaphragm muscle, we'll do it tomorrow, next day. That's the prime mover for inhale. And believe it or not, for chewing, we palpated the muscle during AMP1 when we were doing zygomatic arch. Remember, that's why it's called zygomatic arch, overlapping zygomatic and temporal. When you clench your jaw, you can feel a giant, really powerful contraction right under your zygomatic arch. That's the strongest chewing muscle, masseter. I might not have mentioned the name, but that's considered the prime mover for chewing. Oh, masseter, M-A-S-S-E-T-E-R. So there's really just 4 prime movers in the whole axial group. Sternocleidomastoid for flexion of the neck, erector spinae for extension of trunk, diaphragm for inhale, and masseter for chewing. That's the only 4. But we'll cover them as we do axial.
Well, why did you skip over,
Did I miss something?
I think so, you skipped 20. You skipped over, you went straight to hip flexors, and then you jumped to flexors of the knee.
I didn't do hip extensors? Oh, you're talking about prime
For
mover?
prime movers.
Oh, cause there aren't any.
Because there aren't any.
Yeah,
So
I
no prime
jumped,
movers.
yeah,
Okay.
there's very few prime movers that are recognized or that are gonna be on the test.
For the
I
gyms that
skipped
you
a
went
lot
over.
of categories.
Okay.
I skipped a lot of categories. I will cover them in more detail with all of the mechanical, little fine points starting at 6 o'clock. I will go 6 to 9 and we'll cover everything you don't need to know.
No.
Don't come for it. Everything you don't need to know, but it'll totally confuse you and mess you up, come for the 6 to 9 class. Okay.
It's beautiful out.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not gonna teach it, I bring in a robot. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so, let's say, probably need a break. We'll start, I'll promise to start at 3:45. Now, that, basically, we just need to do origins, insertions, and I'll do a little bit on axial V